What if I told you that the same dream that points to your future can also activate the chain of events that destroys your present? Because that is exactly what happened to Joseph, according to the book of Genesis, chapter 37. Joseph was 17 years old, living in Canaan around the early 2nd millennium BCE, the 11th son of Jacob and the firstborn of Rachel, his father's favored wife, a status that produced measurable consequences rather than abstract resentment, beginning with Jacob's decision to give Joseph a long-sleeved ornamented tunic, an item not used for labor, which functioned as a visible marker of preference and authority in a household economy dependent on manual shepherding, signaling to his older brothers that Joseph was exempt from their workload and potentially elevated above them in inheritance hierarchy. This tension escalated when Joseph reported his brothers' misconduct to their father, a documented trigger that positioned him as both privileged and accusatory. And the conflict reached a critical point when Joseph described two dreams involving agricultural sheaves and celestial bodies bowing to him, imagery that in the ancient Near Eastern context directly symbolized political dominance and familial authority, meaning the offense was not emotional but structural, as Joseph's dreams implied a reversal of birth order, threatening the established power dynamics of the family. The reaction was immediate and specific. Genesis records that his brothers hated him and could not speak peaceably to him, a phrase indicating total social rupture, while even Jacob rebuked Joseph, demonstrating that the dreams destabilized the entire family system rather than merely provoking sibling jealousy. Hatred did not remain passive, because unresolved resentment in a nomadic clan with access to violence tends to convert into action, and the opportunity emerged near Dothan when Joseph was sent alone to check on his brothers, a logistical decision that removed witnesses and protection. The initial plan was murder, with the explicit intention to throw his body into a cistern and fabricate evidence of an animal attack. But the mechanism of Joseph's survival came through intervention by Reuben, the eldest brother, whose motivation was not mercy but damage control, aiming to restore Joseph later and preserve his own standing, which failed when Reuben was absent, and Judah proposed an economically rational alternative, selling Joseph to a passing Midianite caravan for 20 shekels of silver, the standard market price for a young male slave at the time, transforming fratricide into profit. This transaction converted Joseph from family member to commodity, severing his legal identity and placing him into the trans-regional slave trade route connecting Canaan to Egypt, a system designed to erase personal history and enforce total dependency, meaning Joseph's fall was not symbolic, but administrative, social, and irreversible by human means. His brothers then used Joseph's bloodied tunic to deceive Jacob, producing long-term psychological consequences for their father, who mourned for years, while Joseph was transported south with no recorded resistance, no appeals, and no divine intervention, marking the definitive end of his protected life. The data is clear. A dream disclosed without restraint within a volatile power structure triggered a sequence of rational decisions driven by envy, economics, and opportunity, resulting in permanent exile. But this was not the lowest point, because what followed would remove not only Joseph's freedom, but his name, his language, and his future. Joseph arrived in Egypt as property, not a migrant, entering a society whose language, legal codes, religious system, and social hierarchy were entirely alien to a Semitic shepherd from Canaan. Egypt at this period operated on strict class stratification, where slaves had no legal autonomy and survival depended on usefulness. And Joseph was purchased by Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, placing Joseph inside a high-ranking household that functioned as both a domestic and administrative unit. Genesis records a critical detail without explanation. The Lord was with Joseph, which manifests not as miraculous escape but as observable outcomes, because Joseph's labor produced measurable results,
leading Potiphar to transfer operational control of his estate to a foreign slave, a decision that would have required sustained proof of reliability, accuracy in resource management, and trustworthiness over time. Joseph's rise was not symbolic favor, but bureaucratic delegation, as Potiphar relinquished oversight of finances, logistics, and personnel, a mechanism indicating that Joseph mastered the systems of Egyptian household administration despite cultural displacement. The stability of this position was interrupted by a specific event. Potiphar's wife repeatedly attempted to coerce Joseph into sexual relations, exploiting an absolute power imbalance between a mistress and a slave. And Joseph's refusal was not moral abstraction, but strategic risk, since compliance would have ensured security, while resistance guaranteed exposure. When rejected, she accused Joseph of attempted assault, a charge that in Egyptian law did not require corroborating witnesses if made by a household authority, meaning the outcome was predetermined. Potiphar's response was immediate imprisonment, suggesting either belief in the accusation or a calculated effort to suppress scandal within his household. And Joseph was placed in a royal prison, not a common holding cell, indicating confinement reserved for political or state-related offenders. This transition is critical because Joseph moved from private slavery to state incarceration without any recorded defense, trial, or appeal, demonstrating that innocence had no protective function within the power structures he occupied. The narrative emphasizes that Joseph had acted correctly according to both ethical standards and self-preservation logic, yet the consequence was institutional punishment, exposing a structural reality of ancient systems where obedience to God did not equate to legal safety. The fear introduced here is empirical rather than emotional, the documented risk that integrity does not prevent injustice when authority controls narrative than enforcement. However, Joseph's imprisonment also repositioned him within proximity to royal administration, because the prison was attached to Pharaoh's estate and housed officials whose offenses were political rather than criminal, a logistical detail that would later matter. Nothing in the text suggests despair, protest, or divine intervention at this stage, only continued confinement under false charges, marking a progression rather than a pause in Joseph's descent. The data shows a pattern of forced transitions, slave to administrator, administrator to prisoner, each governed by external decisions rather than Joseph's control. And the prison functioned not merely as punishment, but as a closed system where skills, character, and trust would again be tested under surveillance. The story does not frame prison as the end of Joseph's movement, but as a new environment with different constraints and possibilities. And what followed would not reduce his suffering, but would redefine the mechanism through which his future would be determined.
Joseph's imprisonment did not suspend his movement through institutional systems, it relocated it, because the royal prison in which he was confined functioned as a controlled administrative environment attached to Pharaoh's court rather than an anonymous dungeon. And within this setting, Joseph again became observable to authority through service rather than protest, a pattern established earlier but now operating under surveillance and restriction. Genesis states that the warden placed Joseph in charge of the other prisoners, a decision that implies measured competence over time, since prison administration in ancient Egypt involved ration distribution, labor assignment, and order maintenance, none of which would be entrusted to an unstable detainee. The narrative advances when two new prisoners arrive, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of Pharaoh, officials whose positions directly involved the king's life through food and drink security, meaning their incarceration was politically sensitive and temporary rather than criminal, placing Joseph in proximity to individuals with future access to power. Both men experienced symbolic dreams involving food and execution imagery, and Joseph's interpretation did not emerge spontaneously, but relied on established ancient Near Eastern dream symbol frameworks, where objects, numbers, and actions corresponded to outcomes, such as the 3 branches representing 3 days.
Joseph accurately predicted the cupbearer's restoration and the baker's execution, outcomes verified exactly 3 days later on Pharaoh's birthday, a calendrical marker confirming the precision of the interpretations. Before the cupbearer's release, Joseph made a specific request to be remembered and mentioned to Pharaoh, representing a rational attempt to exit the prison through legitimate channels rather than divine intervention. The mechanism of delay begins here because the cupbearer did not act, and Genesis records the duration implicitly rather than emotionally. 2 full years passed without communication, a measurable span during which Joseph remained incarcerated despite proven accuracy and administrative trust. This interval is not filled with new events, which is precisely its function in the narrative, demonstrating that silence itself can be an operative force when systems depend on human memory and political convenience. The phrase, "the cupbearer did not remember Joseph," is not poetic but procedural, indicating that Joseph's release depended entirely on another man's decision, which never occurred until external pressure forced recall. During this period, Joseph did not receive new dreams, new promises, or divine explanations, and the text records no prayers or complaints, only continued service within the prison's hierarchy. The cause and effect structure is clear. Joseph's skills placed him near influence, but proximity without timing produced stagnation, reinforcing that capability alone does not trigger transition. The interruption came abruptly when Pharaoh himself experienced 2 dreams involving livestock and grain, symbols with national economic implications rather than personal fate, and none of Egypt's trained magicians or scribes could decode them, creating an institutional crisis that forced the cupbearer's memory into action. This recall was not sentimental but utilitarian, as Joseph became a solution to a state problem rather than a forgotten prisoner. The narrative's speed shifts immediately at this point, compressing years of waiting into a single moment of summons, signaling that Joseph's prolonged obscurity functioned as accumulation rather than absence, and what followed would not unfold gradually, but with administrative urgency and irreversible consequence.
The transition occurred because Pharaoh experienced 2 sequential dreams that carried national-level implications rather than personal symbolism, involving 7 healthy cows consumed by 7 diseased cows, and 7 full ears of grain swallowed by 7 scorched ones, imagery tied directly to agricultural cycles that underpinned Egypt's economy. And when Egypt's professional interpreters, magicians trained in ritual texts, and scribes educated in symbolic manuals failed to produce a coherent explanation, the breakdown exposed a critical vulnerability in the state's advisory system. At this point, the cupbearer recalled Joseph not as an innocent man, but as a proven problem solver whose prior interpretations had been empirically verified, prompting an immediate summons that bypassed normal release procedures, resulting in Joseph being shaved, reclothed, and transported directly from prison to the royal court in a single administrative motion. Joseph's interpretation identified the dreams as a single message with a doubled form to emphasize certainty, explaining that 7 consecutive years of agricultural surplus would be followed by 7 years of famine severe enough to erase all memory of abundance, a prediction grounded in Nile-dependent crop cycles where irregular flooding could destabilize food supply across the region. Crucially, Joseph extended beyond interpretation into policy, proposing a centralized storage system involving a 20% grain tax during surplus years, local granaries, and controlled distribution during famine, a solution that aligned directly with Egypt's existing bureaucratic infrastructure, making it actionable rather than theoretical. Pharaoh's response was immediate because Joseph's proposal solved both the interpretive failure and the logistical crisis simultaneously. And within the same day, Joseph was appointed second in command over all of Egypt, receiving Pharaoh's signet ring, fine linen garments, and a gold chain,
symbols of legal authority, economic access, and social elevation, while being assigned a new Egyptian name and marriage into the priestly elite, formally integrating him into the ruling class. This promotion did not occur through gradual trust building, but through functional necessity, as Joseph's competence addressed an imminent systemic threat, demonstrating that alignment between skill, timing, and institutional need can compress years of waiting into hours of transition. Joseph immediately implemented the storage policy, overseeing nationwide grain collection during the 7 years of abundance and establishing distribution controls that later positioned Egypt as a regional supplier during the famine, drawing surrounding populations, including Canaan, into economic dependency on Egypt's reserves. The narrative makes no mention of celebration or personal reflection at this stage, focusing instead on administrative execution and structural transformation, indicating that Joseph's rise was not framed as personal vindication, but as state stabilization. The mechanisms of his ascent are documented and procedural: verified expertise, strategic recommendation, and decisive delegation. However, the text signals a new phase of testing, not rooted in scarcity or injustice, but in authority itself, because the famine would eventually bring Joseph face to face with unresolved personal history, and the power he now held would expose whether his transformation was merely positional or internal, setting the stage for a confrontation where policy success would give way to moral reckoning, and the outcome would determine whether Joseph's rise completed the story or complicated it beyond calculation.